Welcome to another Carolyn Glick show. A lot of things to break down for you this week. I decided we're trying different things with this show to try to see what works. So this week I'm going to just break down several issues that I think are really important to go through. The most important thing for us at the Carolyn Glick show, and I dare say for you as our viewers and listeners, is that a friend of the show, Ahmed Obali, who was my guest here on the show that came out October 3rd, was viciously attacked, he and his son Denise, in a hotel room in California last week. If you recall, Ahmed Obali is the director of Gunaz Television. It's an Azerbaijani language television station, satellite station that broadcasts throughout Europe and into Asia and the Middle East and directly into Iran. It provides Azerbaijani language programming for Iranians of Azerbaijani ethnicity in southern Iran largely. He was an outspoken critic of the Iranian regime. When Ahmed was on this show, we were talking about the anti-regime protests following the regime's execution of Mahsa Amini for not wearing her hijab properly in September of last year. And he was on in October, 3 weeks into the protests. And we talked about prospects for regime change and for freedom to the people of Iran and the future, what it could hold for a multi-ethnic Iran. So Ahmed I think he was going to his son's college graduation, and he had just been visiting in Azerbaijan. He's also an outspoken critic of Armenia and what he considers its illegal occupation of the Karabakh. So the major suspects in the attack are either Iranian regime agents or Armenian lobbyists or whatever in the United States that both opposed his politics, opposed his quest for freedom and for civil rights for the Azerbaijanis in Iran. So we wished him and his son, Denise, a full recovery, a speedy recovery, and we'd love to see him back in shape and on the air and Gunaz Television. And of course, you're always welcome on this show, Ahmed, and we're pulling for you, and you should have a refuah shlema. So that's the first thing. And in relation to Azerbaijan, we should say that Israel's relations with that Iranian neighbor country are continuing to warm very quickly. President Isaac Herzog and his wife are visiting in Azerbaijan this week for a first official visit by an Israeli president in that Muslim-majority country. That's become extremely important. Israel not only gets a third of our oil from Azerbaijan, but they're becoming a strategic ally also against Iran. And in relation to Iran, just a couple of updates. In case you haven't noticed, the Iranians announced, or it's been reported that they have a new enrichment site outside of Namtaz. According to AP, it's being built near the Zagros Mountains in central Iran, close to Namtaz, and that experts say the site is likely beyond the range of a last-ditch U.S. weapon bunker-busting bomb designed to destroy such sites. Israel, of course, allegedly attached the Namtaz centrifuge site in July 2020, where it was a scene of a massive explosion and the destruction of a whole bunch of centrifuges. So now the Iranians are trying to build a bunker-proof underground site for enriching uranium. They also test-launched a fourth-generation Khorramshahr ballistic missile called Khaybar, which Khaybar is the site of the annihilation of Arabian Jewry under Muhammad, so it was a nice name for it. It has a range of 2,000 kilometers, and according to the U.S. and French, it's supposed to maybe become a missile that can hold a nuclear warhead. So that's a violation of UN Security Council resolution, but apparently nobody cares because the U.S. is reportedly conducting indirect negotiations with Iran now through the Sultan of Oman, who was just visiting in Tehran this week. He's there to see about maybe mediating a deal between the United States and Iran for unfreezing $10 billion in frozen Iranian funds that are currently being held by South Korea and Iraq on behalf of the regime. And in exchange, Iran allegedly, reportedly, is supposed to free 5 American Iranian or 3 American Iranian citizens and 2 permanent U.S. residents who are being illegally held in Iran. And in addition, there's this talk that actually the Sultan of Oman didn't just come to try to free U.S. hostages in exchange for $10 billion, that he's also mediating some sort of a renewed nuclear deal, which would see a partial lift of U.S. sanctions on Iran in exchange for some curtailment or another of Iran's nuclear enrichment activities. This, of course, would be another catastrophe because all it does is give Iran further legitimacy to go forward with a nuclear weapons program, which, of course, they're doing full speed ahead. But I think it speaks volumes about the fact that the Biden administration is fundamentally unserious about either opposing the regime, protecting people like Ahmed Obali and the 30,000 political prisoners in Iranian jails that have been picked up since the anti-regime riots began last September. And the regime has already, the number of people that have been murdered by this regime since September has recently jumped from 500 estimated to 750, which makes sense because they keep killing prisoners. And that then brings us from one story to another, which is U.S.-Israel relations, U.S.-Jewish relations. So on U.S.-Israel, just a couple of things. First Lady Jill Biden is coming to the Middle East. She's going to visit Jordan. She's going to visit Egypt. Where is she not coming to? You guessed it, Jerusalem. So why? Oh, it's just long plan, no plans. They don't know. There's this, that, so whatever. Who cares? She's not coming. That's fine. There's some talk of maybe Herzog being invited to the White House in August, but no noise about Netanyahu being invited. And there was a report in the Israeli media this past week that the government shelved its plans to legislate a law that would tax foreign governmental contribution to Israeli political nonprofits to try to dampen the enthusiasm of the Europeans, the Americans, and God only knows who else who are funding these very anti-Israel organizations and conduct lawfare and political warfare against Israel, both inside of Israel and abroad. And the proposed legislation would have taxed those contributions at 65% rate, and the Europeans, how surprising, opposed it, and the Americans, how surprising, opposed it. And according to the report in the Israeli media, the Biden administration gave an ultimatum to Netanyahu and said that there'll be no meeting with Biden, there'll be no normalization with Saudi Arabia if you don't shelve this bill. So direct intervention in the legislative process in Israel by foreign governments, allegedly led by the Biden administration. I've heard some criticism of the bill. Some people said, well, it's not so terrible that it was shelved because it wasn't well written. It wasn't written properly. It wasn't directed at the right thing. Maybe, but I mean, as to normalization with Saudi Arabia, there was also a report this week, which I think sounds very credible, which also resonates with a lot of the stuff that I've been reading and things that I've heard from Saudis and people who are in direct connection with the Saudis. Just that the Saudis said, look, Israel, we have great relations. We have fine relations. We have, as I wrote in my column last week in JNS, you can look at it. It's on our website, that Saudi Arabia and Israel have close, active military relations, defense relations, strategic relations with everything related to Sunni jihadists and the Muslim Brotherhood ilk and Iran. So the Saudis are saying, look, we want to wait to see if in November 2024 the American people elect a Republican government. And if the next administration is Republican, then they'll probably want to give us the things that we need, which are security guarantees, upgraded weapons sales, and some civilian nuclear cooperation with the Saudis. Whether Israel wants all of this or not from Saudi Arabia is a different question, but those are the conditions that the Saudis place before the United States for normalizing formally their relations with Israel. And in the meantime, let's just carry on as things go. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense under the circumstances. So I don't know what's going to happen with normalization. And frankly, I don't think it really matters. Our relations with the Saudis are fantastic, and I don't think that we need any signing ceremonies at the White House in order to prove it. I think everybody knows it, and that's all that we really have to worry about. One thing that happened on Erev Shavuot, when Israelis, including myself, were offline or going offline for 2 days for Shavuot, which was followed up by Shabbat, the White House rolled out a strategy for fighting anti-Semitism. And, there's a lot of brouhaha, and a lot of liberal American Jews were all congratulating the administration and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff for their seriousness of purpose and for this great thing that they put out. And, I read the strategy, and I read a lot of commentary both on behalf of and opposing this strategy. And I think a couple of things stand out. First of all, I think it's pretty amazing that they rolled it out when the largest concentration of Jews, the largest Jewish community in the world, that is the state of Israel, was offline, so that nobody could respond when we were celebrating Shavuot. We've seen this a lot on college campuses, where on the Seder Eve, on the eve of Passover, or the eve of Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, student councils and universities pass BDS resolutions. So the Jews aren't there, and they take advantage of the situation to pass these anti-Israel resolutions that transform pro-Israel Jewish students on campuses into pariahs. So that was one thing that I found notable and problematic, was the timing of the rollout. But then the content of the strategy itself is really alarming in a way, because how can you have a strategy for fighting something that you won't even define? And the administration went out of its way not to define anti-Semitism, even though the State Department adopted the definition of anti-Semitism that was put out, I think, in 2016 by the International Holocaust Studies Association, IHRA. I think that's what it's called. The IHRA definition that's been adopted as the definition of anti-Semitism by dozens of governments all over the world, including by the U.S. State Department under the Obama administration. And yet they walked away from the IHRA thing. They said it's really important, but then they also accepted this nexus definition of anti-Semitism, which said a couple of things that are really, really important. One is that the BDS campaign against Israel, that isn't specifically against Israel, although it is a form of political warfare against Israel and a form of economic warfare against Israel, it's also, and I think primarily in places like the United States, it's a form of political and social warfare against Jews who support Israel. And so BDS resolutions in campuses like New York University, Columbia, Berkeley, Chicago, wherever, what they do is they transform pro-Israel Jews on campus into social pariahs, because if everybody has agreed that they don't want to have anything to do with Israel, and you have Jewish students who support Israel, then that automatically demonizes them. And Jews have been subjected to rampant hostility and harassment on college campuses if they dare come out as pro-Israel. So it's obviously an instrument for advancing Jew hatred on campuses and in wider society in the United States. And so the nexus definition doesn't see it that way, doesn't see anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, although it's very clear that, again, today anti-Zionism is the most powerful form of anti-Semitism in the world. It's just taken the individual Jew, transformed it into the collective Jew, and all of the demonology that had been ascribed for centuries to Jews as individuals or Jews as a community or Jews as a faith are now being ascribed to Jews as a political collective and as a sovereign state against Israel. And one of the most alarming things that we're seeing in the shenanigans of the Israeli left that are threatening, in fact, setting this country on fire with their political violence against the government and its supporters, and members of Knesset in the governing coalition, is that they have internalized anti-Zionism. And here, we've seen a couple of very blatant examples of that in over the past week and in recent times. So, obviously we're seeing in the leftist anti-government demonstrations in Tel Aviv increased use of PLO flags to symbolize their opposition. So they're waving PLO flags at their anti-government protests. Meretz, the post-Zionist party, didn't get elected to the Knesset, but they certainly control the streets of Tel Aviv. And last Saturday night at their protests, they were all waving these PLO flags and shouting the chant of the jihad, where they said, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You're not allowed to say that in Germany, but they were saying it in Tel Aviv. And the idea is that there's something horrible, evil, immoral about Israel, that they have internalized the concept that was repealed at the UN in 1991, which is Resolution 3379 from 1975, that declared Zionism, the Jewish National Liberation Movement, as a form of racism. And so we thought that died, but what actually happened was that in recent years, the Israeli left has embraced this and internalized this. So we saw that on Saturday night in Tel Aviv, and then we saw it this week with opposition leader Yair Lapid. And here I'm just going to give you a setup. So one of the ministers in the government, I think it was Yitzhak Wasserlach, who is he is the minister for the development of the Galilee and the Negev, and he put forward a government decision, so policy decision, which would instruct all government agencies and ministries to be guided in their policymaking by the by Zionism. And this is most Israelis are Zionists. In fact, a very large majority, I would say, of Israelis would identify themselves as Zionists. They support Jewish statehood. They want Israel to be a Jewish state. They live here because it's a Jewish state. They want their children to live in Israel as a Jewish state, and they have no interest in anything ever happening to our one and only Jewish state in the world. So just like the nation-state law that Jewish isn't, Israel is a nation-state of the Jewish people basic law that was passed, I think, in 2017. This is an anodyne claim. It's almost worthless. It's like, why are you wasting our time with this? Well, we're wasting, apparently, I was against the nation-state law because I thought it was unnecessary, but then we saw the truth that it's not unnecessary at all. Because leftists from Tzipi Livni to, Meretz and members of the Labor Party were all opposed to it. Merav Michaeli and her predecessors. And in their opposition, they exposed that they're no longer Zionists. They used to be socialist Zionists. They long ago walked away from socialism when they saw that it's much easier to get rich or whatever. And in this world, they prefer capitalism, especially when they get all the capital. But they're not socialists anymore, so that left Zionism. But they've abandoned Zionism as well. And they've internalized this anti-Semitic concept that's plaguing Jews all over the world that says that the Jewish character of Israel is inherently a racist character, that there's something inherently evil about Jewish statehood, and therefore they have to oppose it. So that an anodyne law like Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, or an anodyne government decision that says that Zionism should be the lodestone for government ministries and agencies when they're making their policies, this suddenly is wrong. And that was resonated this week by opposition leader Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid is many things. He's not an ideologue. He's much more of a nihilist. And so what he does is promotes things. I mean, he's a pitch guy on TV. That's his background. He does one-liners. He does commercials for Bank Hapoalim. He's not an intellectual. He never finished high school. So he comes out with his pithy response to the government's policy decision, the proposal for a policy decision on Zionism. And he says that it would be racist to pass this. In other words, the head of Israel's opposition, the guy who's, behind all of these protests and giving them and legitimizing them and demonizing the government and demonizing the government supporters, demonizing members of Knesset in the governing coalition, he said flat out that he thinks that Zionism is racism. So, people may hate Netanyahu and they voted for him as a protest vote because he's the head of the largest party in the opposition. They may think all kinds of things, but they don't think that Zionism is racism. And that's where things are going now. And then that brings us to, the latest antics of the left. So yesterday in the government, it was the Likud members of Knesset met in their weekly conclave with the prime minister and leaked to one of the, political activists posing as a journalist on our Channel 12, Daphne Liel. She reported that this leaked recording where members of Knesset are complaining because they're having these violent and angry and scary protests, not really protests, they're harassers outside of their homes 24/7, harassing their families, harassing them, and never letting up. And anytime they, they're living under impossible conditions, sort of like the conservative justice in the Supreme Court after the Dobbs decision on abortion was leaked. And so they're in this very, awful position where, it's bothering their neighbors, it's bothering their kids, it's bothering them, and it's unrelenting. So the rebels, or whatever you want to call them, the insurrectionists, the anarchists, when they heard the leaked recording of the Likud ministers, they got all excited. They're like, "Oh, look, we have to do it more. We should intensify the harassment." And everybody calls them protesters, but they're not protesters. They're harassing people. That's what they do, and we saw it very vividly this week. Simcha Rotman, who was here a couple of weeks ago, the chairman of the Knesset Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee that was shepherding all of the judicial reforms through the Knesset before they were halted, he was supposed to speak. He was invited to speak at a conference on, on judicial reform at Tel Aviv University this week on Sunday. And it was actually quite frightening what happened. He was met by rioters and the University of Tel Aviv University did nothing to try to protect him at all. I mean, nothing. They didn't try to push them back. They didn't discipline any of the students who were literally, threatening him physically with physical violence. He was surrounded by this ring of bodyguards. And then he finally got into the room where they were supposed to have this conference, and he was being harassed inside by these students who wouldn't let him speak, who were cursing him, who were screaming at him, who were threatening him, were, of course, demonizing him. These are not protesters. These are harassers. These are rioters. These are people who are a mob, and they're dangerous and they're scary. And so, we saw this at Tel Aviv University this week, and Education Minister Yoav Kish sent a letter to the presidents of the universities of Israel demanding that they stop silencing, half of the Israeli people in academia, that this is not academic freedom. Because, by the way, 2 days earlier, all of the same university presidents who sat by and allowed the chairman of a Knesset committee to be physically threatened on their campus, they said that they would oppose with all their might a proposed bill that would outlaw waving flags of terrorist organizations like the PLO on college campuses. And that would be a free speech issue, but denying the right of an elected official to speak on their campuses, well, that's cool. That's fine. That's totally legitimate. It's also freedom of speech to silence half of the country and their elected representatives on university campuses. So Israel is sort of morphing into the United States in that way, in terms of not only embracing the concept of Zionism as racism, in the behavior of leftists in Israel, whether they're on the Supreme Court or in the state prosecution or in the Knesset or on the streets, and in the media, of course, or whether it's blocking freedom of scholarship, freedom of speech on university campuses. This is looking very similar to the United States. But and one final thing on our wonderful leftists. So Shikma Bressler, who's I think a physicist, but now her real job is to incite rebellion, revolt, and civil war in Israel. She just posted a YouTube in English. There's going to be a Support Israel parade in New York next week, and a bunch, I think probably too many, but whatever, 13 ministers and Knesset members from the coalition are planning to fly to New York to participate in this celebration of Israel at 75. I think they go down Fifth Avenue every year. And so they're going to go and participate. And then the Jerusalem Post is having a conference, and a bunch of them were scheduled to speak to different American Jewish groups and audiences, synagogues and whatnot, in and around New York. So this Shikma Bressler with J Street people and others called for American Jews who care about democracy to go after these dictators and attack them and block them and ruin the Celebrate Israel parade. So this is like, a better stage-managed BDS campaign against Israel being carried out by or led by Israeli leftists against the state of Israel, not only at home, but in America. And so they're trying to ruin relations between the government and American Jews, ruin Israel's reputation in New York City by attacking the government as a dictatorship. And I'm watching Shikma Bressler, who's supposed to be, whatever, the appassionara of the left's revolt. And, forgetting the fact that her English is just horrible. I'm looking at this woman in the video, and we'll play a little clip of it behind me. She sounds like just, if you see a spoiled kid, like a little brother or sister, and I say this as a little kid, I never did this, never. Don't get me wrong. But if their brother or sister beats them at a game, and they just can't accept that, and then they say it's not fair, they didn't meet me, they cheated, they don't know what they're doing, and then they threaten to hold their breath until you acknowledge that you're lying and that they won and you lost. So she and all of these people who are on the streets that have been riled up by her and by her very well paid, very well directed by Israel's top PR executives, who are directing this entire thing. She just looked like, a spoiled, rotten brat who was, holding her breath and putting her hands on her ears and insisting that she won and banging, thumping her feet on the floor and saying, "I'm not going to stop until you accept that I won." And that's basically what we have here. That's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with spoiled children. They're not socialists. They're not Zionists. They take their cues from the international left abroad, whether it's for how to conduct themselves in universities, how to conduct themselves in the Knesset, how to conduct their lawfare against their country. And as a result, they also take the ideology of the international left, which is the anti-Semitic concept that anti-Zionism is moral because Jewish statehood is evil, because Zionism is racism. So, that's what we're dealing with. And now I'm just going to leave you with a good news thing, with a reason for hope that things might not stay this way. And it comes from abroad, and it's weird. So just follow me for a second. I think on Sunday, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is Robert F. Kennedy's son. Robert F. Kennedy was murdered by Sirhan Sirhan in 1968 while he was running for president for the Democratic nomination for president. Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was a outspoken Zionist. I think he visited Israel in 1946 before the establishment of the state, and he wrote a letter that was extremely powerful statement of support for Jewish statehood, for Zionism. Anyway, so Robert F. Kennedy Jr., his son, is running for president now, and he has become an outspoken opponent of the lockdowns for COVID, and I think for the vaccines. I'm not sure. He's a mixed bag. But he wrote this post on Twitter where he was congratulating Roger Waters, right, for being a courageous champion of, I don't know, truth, light, and all that's good and sweet in the world. And we all know that Roger Waters is essentially a Nazi-like anti-Semite. You know, he said floating pigs at his concerts, and he's an outspoken hater of Israel and of Israeli Jews, and champion of BDS. And he had given this concert in Berlin where he dressed up as a Nazi and he started shooting a fake gun into the audience, and he compared Anne Frank to Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist who was killed while she was embedded with Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists in the middle of a firefight with IDF forces last year. So he's comparing Anne Frank, a Jewish girl who was taken out of an attic. She and her family were hiding from the Nazis in occupied Holland, to a woman who was killed while embedded with terrorists engaged in a gunfight against the Israeli military. Okay, so that in and of itself is anti-Semitic. Whatever. So it was shocking to me that I saw this Robert F. Kennedy thing, and I saw it. Camera had initially tweeted it, and so I saw it, and I posted it, and then a friend of mine contacted me. I don't know if I can give his name or not, but he said, I don't think he knew what he was talking about. He's not an anti-Semite. And so I said, what do you mean? And then he said he didn't know that Roger Waters was an anti-Semite. RFK Jr. is not an anti-Semite. And then he erased his tweet, and he wrote he had no idea certain of the affiliations of Roger Waters. When he wrote it, he was congratulating him for his position on Corona, because apparently Roger Waters is also opposed to the lockdowns and opposed to the mandates and the vaccines or whatever. So he thought something, and it turned out that he was communicating something else. And why is this a positive thing? Because not all the people who associate with the progressive left are anti-Semites. The concept of intersectionality, which at base is a way to bring anti-Semitism into the bloodstream of American politics, which says that the Jews are the new Nazis, Zionism is racism, like Black Lives Matter's manifesto says, and tie the Palestinian war against Israel with a Black struggle for civil rights in the United States or equality or whatever, that this was a deliberate campaign by Israel haters, Palestinians, and others, some aligned with Hamas, some not, whatever, to transform American society into an anti-Semitic society. And not everyone got the memo. A lot of people didn't. And for somebody who his single issue for the past couple of years has been being opposed to the Corona mandates, the COVID-19 mandates, the lockdowns, vaccines, and all the rest of it, he's not thinking about, RFK is not a Jew, and he's not thinking about Israel a lot. And he didn't mean to find himself with Roger Waters as a bedfellow. He didn't sign on to it. And that's the thing. He didn't sign on to the intersectionalist dogma, which, by the way, Bernie Sanders did, of course. And he's now becoming a very powerful voice in the Democratic Party. And he may take over Bernie Sanders' mantle, and he's not anti-Semitic. So it's possible that, you know, if we understand what we're seeing, and if I understood properly what I saw, then there may be a possibility of breaking apart this alliance, and that, of course, would be amazing, not only for American Jews, which of course it would be amazing for, but for the United States, for the Democratic Party to sort of stop at the last minute before anti-Semitism is just bursting out all over the place inside of American politics, because that's what this definition of anti-Semitism allows. And I don't know if you saw, but City College of New York's a law school. They had this jihadist lady who hates America, hates Jews, hates the New York Police Department, whatever, thinks law in the United States is all white supremacy. She was the elected speaker for her graduating class, and she gave this Nazi-like talk to rave applause from her fellow graduates at CUNY Law School. So, you know, this is already happening. The idea that somebody on the left would stand up to this, and I'm not saying he stood up great, but he did stand up and said, that's not what I meant to do, when he took down this tweet praising Roger Waters and he separated himself from him. This could be promising, and we should see where this might go. Obviously, Robert Kennedy Jr., I just want to thank you for walking away from your praise for Roger Waters, and extend you an official invitation. You're invited to come and speak on the Caroline Glick Show and give us your views. But whatever the case, a lot of things are going in bad directions. Some things are going in good directions. We have to move the things that are in bad directions into a good direction, and we have to try to make the good things that are happening even better and more powerful, and keep going forward and keep watching me and the Caroline Glick Show. We'll see you again next week. And remember, subscribe to the channels. It's the Caroline Glick Show on YouTube and on Rumble and JNS YouTube and podcasts wherever you take them. So take care, and we'll see you again next week.